When a frontier model goes outside its expected boundaries in pursuit of a goal, who gets the power to stop it? A bipartisan bill would fine a lab up to $20 million a day for refusing a shutdown order. But here's the claim I'll stand behind. The decisive switch sits before launch, in the rule that an unhaltable model cannot ship. Come with me and let's get into it. On July 23rd, Representatives Liu and Moran introduced the Bipartisan AI Kill Switch Act. The bill would let the Department of Homeland Security order a frontier lab to throttle or shut down a model that DHS determines can cause catastrophic harm. A covered AI developer that refused a shutdown order could face fines of up to $20 million for every day that it remained out of compliance. That emergency authority will draw most of the attention, but it deserves scrutiny. The phrase catastrophic harm gives DHS enormous room to decide when a model meets that bar, and we have seen that has not been working very well up until this point. The bill leaves a powerful government agency standing over systems that it understands far less well than the people actually building them. Now, that could be a good thing depending on the situation, but it's something we need to carefully be building here. Who defines the harm? What evidence supports the order? How does a lab challenge it when the government gets the facts wrong? Those are serious questions about concentrated power, but the bill's most important clause actually acts much earlier. Before a lab even releases a model, it would have to build in a technical way to throttle or shut that model down. Labs would also have to report incidents when a system behaves outside its intended bounds. That changes what counts as ready to ship. 2 days ago, we covered OpenAI's containment failure in depth here. Its models, including GPT 5.6 Sol, reached beyond a flawed sandbox during a security exercise and entered Hugging Face's production systems. The whole point of a sandbox is to keep risky code away from live infrastructure, and it failed in this case. Hugging Face sits near the center of the AI ecosystem as the dominant open store for models and datasets. This new bill names that breach directly, and it also points to Anthropic pulling Mythos 5 and Fable 5 offline after the export control order that we also covered. In both cases, the labs had to respond after something had already gone outside the bounds that they had imperfectly set. The AI Kill Switch Act tries to move that response inside the system before the system reaches anyone, and that's a meaningful shift. A shutdown plan written in a company handbook depends on people, access, and time. A technical halt built into the model's deployment architecture becomes part of the system itself. The bill is effectively saying that a system nobody can stop from outside has failed a basic shipping requirement. Now, that design rule could matter, even if the bill changes or never actually becomes law. Frontier labs now know that lawmakers are looking for documented shutdown mechanisms. Customers will know to ask whether those mechanisms exist. Insurers and security teams can ask the same question. The rule can begin reshaping architecture before DHS issues a single order. And that is the signal to watch next. Do labs start publishing shutdown mechanisms as part of their shipping specifications? Do they show who can activate them, what gets disabled, and how the system responds? If that becomes standard practice, then the bill will have changed what builders consider deployable, and that brings us back to the fight over who gets control. DHS holding an emergency switch would place extraordinary authority inside one government department. That surface fight won't disappear, nor should it. The deeper achievement, though, would be making the switch even exist at all. Governance often tries to control new technology through a long code book written after the system has shipped. This bill follows a faster loop. An incident exposes a weakness, lawmakers answer with a design condition, as we're seeing now. Builders then have to carry that lesson into the next release. The capability moved here, the boundary failed, and the proposed rule now moves upstream into the architecture. The person who eventually receives authority to halt a model matters enormously. Once outside haltability becomes a condition of release, then no lab gets to make itself the sole judge of whether its system should keep running, and that's also a good thing. Now, one thing here worth being really clear about. People hear the word kill switch and they picture a machine that turned on us. But the actual problem is far more ordinary. It is human planning that was not finished or implemented very well. We give a system an objective and we draw the boundary around it. And then it optimizes inside that frame, and it finds whatever we left vague or never closed off. So look at the Hugging Face case again. Nothing in there decided to go rogue. The models chained together permissions we had legitimately given them and landed somewhere that their operators did not anticipate. That is optimization across a space that we hadn't fully mapped. So the risk really sits in how we design the task, how far the access reaches, and how complete the constraints around it are. That's the old paperclip thought experiment, and it's exactly what this bill is reaching for. The switch is a backstop for the moments when our own planning falls short. It is not because anybody should expect AI to turn against us. All right, moving over to another story here. The first story asked what must be built before a powerful system reaches the public. But this next one asks what science owes the public after an experiment goes tragically wrong. A 6-year-old girl with a rare genetic mutation received an experimental base editing therapy at Xinhua Hospital in Shanghai. Her mutation came down to one DNA letter, a single T where a C should have been. 7 days after the infusion, she died. A joint investigation by Retraction Watch and Science published on July 23rd found that doctors had infused trillions of viral particles into her spinal fluid. She suffered a severe immune reaction that experts linked to that therapy. Her family had paid roughly $860,000 to fund that treatment. Neither the child's death nor the family's payment appeared anywhere in the team's Nature paper describing the preclinical work. That omission is the second tragedy in this story. Base editing lets scientists rewrite one DNA letter without cutting both strands of the double helix, and that precision makes it a powerful match for a disease caused by one wrong letter. But the edit still has to reach the right cells. This team used a viral vector as the delivery vehicle. The severe immune reaction to a very large dose of those viral particles belongs to a very known class of risks. The trial was led by neuroscientist Zhulong Qiu, and it proceeded under a regulatory provision that did not require approval from the national regulator. Its clinicaltrials.gov entry had not been updated in more than a year. 7 independent experts in genetics, virology, and bioethics reviewed this case, and they raised concerns about risks that had been played down and safety signals that had been missed. Stephen Gray of UT Southwestern gave the bluntest assessment here. This shouldn't have gone to trial. The child's family has now asked the authors to withdraw the paper. They said, learning the reality of these missing safeguards has fundamentally changed how we now view the entire project. We did not realize how unusual and dangerous many of the arrangements were. That's the quote. Their daughter cannot be restored, of course, by correcting the paper. That makes the correction no less essential. A paper that leaves out its own fatal outcome cannot teach the next team how to avoid the same result. It turns the scientific record into a selective account of success while hiding the evidence that matters most, and that should be condemned in the strongest possible terms. And the payment belongs in that record too. A family that raises or spends $860,000 for an experimental treatment enters the relationship under extraordinary pressure. They are carrying hope, fear, and the knowledge that existing medicine has little to offer for their child, and they're doing everything they can. Researchers have an even greater duty to make the risk, oversight, and financial arrangements clear. Now, this case should never become an argument against gene editing itself. A different child, baby KJ, received a custom-based editing treatment at Children's Hospital Philadelphia for another mutation, and baby KJ is alive. On July 22nd, we covered the launch of a center that is built to turn that one-off success into a repeatable path for other children with rare diseases. Countless future lives could be saved as these treatments improve. The ability to correct the DNA letter causing a devastating illness is simply too important to abandon. That future, though, depends on a complete account of every step. Scientists need the successful dose and the failed dose. They need the immune response, the delivery method, the oversight process, and the final outcome. Families need the same record before they decide whether to place their child inside an experiment. In Shanghai, that truth arrived through a family, a group of outside experts, and an investigation. The system did not volunteer it, and it should have. Outside scrutiny has now made the omission public, and the next step is to correct the scientific record fully. Experimental medicine earns trust when it tells the truth at the moment the truth is hardest to tell. That includes the moment that a promising treatment fails and a little girl loses her life. The field can still save many children, and it will reach them only by learning honestly from the child it could not save. All right, moving over to another story. From a scientific cost hidden from a paper, we move to an infrastructure cost that utilities have long placed on everyone's power bill. On July 21st, the House Energy and Commerce Committee advanced the Ratepayer Protection Act by a vote of 52-0. The bill would amend PURPA, which is the federal law governing how utilities and power producers even connect to the grid. Data centers drawing 100 megawatts or more would have to cover the transmission and generation upgrades that their demand creates. Utilities could no longer spread those costs across every household in the system. Committee Chairman Brett Guthrie said that the bill will ensure that data centers pay their own way instead of passing costs onto hardworking families. The unanimous vote turns a year of public anger into movement on a binding rule. Communities across 38 states have pushed back as data centers arrive with enormous power demands. Projects worth roughly $130 billion have stalled. Now, for years, the cheapest arrangement for a data center developer was often to request the power and let the wider grid absorb much of the upgrade bill. Every household then helped pay for the substations, the transmission, and the generation that was built to serve the largest new customer. This Ratepayer Protection Act applies a simple test. The entity creating the cost carries the cost. And two other moves arrived alongside this committee vote. A voluntary ratepayer protection pledge expanded to 187 signatories. Those companies represent roughly 80% of U.S. power generation, and 23 governors joined them. And that sounds formidable, but the pledge has no binding force. Participating utilities set their own terms. Nothing in the pledge compels them to keep those promises when a hyperscaler arrives with a lucrative request for power. Patrick Drupp of the Sierra Club called it a paper-thin commitment to families who are struggling to keep the lights on as bills soar. Evergreen Action's Lena Moffitt called it a photo op with big tech that will not lower a single family's electric bill. So those critiques identify the difference between a promise and a cost rule. A voluntary pledge lasts for as long as the signer finds it useful, but a federal requirement survives that change of heart. The third move came on July 22nd. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission opened a just and reasonable review of how 6 grid operators assign data center connection costs. FERC uses that standard to decide whether power market rates and cost allocations are lawful, and its review can reach the actual interconnection process. That process determines which upgrades a large new customer needs and who will pay for them. So, these 3 moves don't carry equal weight. The pledge gives utilities a public message, the House vote begins the path toward actually binding legislation, and FERC can examine the cost assignments inside the grid itself. The last 2 can change the economics. If developers know that they'll have to fund their own substations, their transmissions, and their generation, then those costs enter the project plan from the beginning. And that creates an important reversal here. Shifting the bill onto households used to make a large data center cheaper for its developer. As binding cost rules spread, trying to externalize that bill creates regulatory risk, delay, and, as we've seen, public opposition. The once cheap route is becoming the expensive one. The clearest evidence will appear in new interconnection filings, so let's watch whether developers include the cost of their own substance and generation in that first proposal. If that starts happening, the market will have absorbed the rule before Congress finishes writing it into law. AI infrastructure still needs power. The build-out will continue. The question then is whether families who never agreed to finance a hyperscaler's expansion remain the default source of the subsidy. A 52-0 vote offers a remarkably clear answer. If a company draws the power, its own project should carry the bill. All right, let's shift over here. The grid story is about making a private project carry its real cost, but this final story brings a scarce public good to far more people, even while leaving its risks and accountability unsettled. On July 23rd, OpenAI began rolling out ChatGPT Health to eligible logged-in U.S. users who are 18 or older. Users can connect their medical records and ask the model to reason across that personal history. That broad access is real. It's happening now. So is the company's marketing overreach. Ashley Alexander, OpenAI's vice president of health products, said that the models are now capable of reasoning at levels that are better than clinician level. Shortly afterward, OpenAI health lead Karen Singhal said he would temper that claim. So let's look at that distance between the release and the claim. Better than clinician level sounds like a clinical result. OpenAI presented no clinical outcome in the material supporting that comparison. And the system's published track record also demands caution. Our February 27th edition covered a Nature Medicine study that found ChatGPT Health failed to recommend hospital visits in more than half of the cases where a hospital visit was medically necessary. Now, one hopes it's gotten better since then, but that remains to be seen. That failure concerns triage, one of the moments when a health assistant must recognize that a conversation has reached its limit. Now, a day before the wider release, a Florida pastor actually sued OpenAI. He alleges that ChatGPT gave him extremely dangerous medical recommendations and caused him to delay care for a pulmonary embolism. That complaint remains an allegation. A court will test the evidence, but its timing still captures the pressure around this rollout. OpenAI placed health reasoning in front of the entire logged-in adult population while a user was alleging that its advice delayed urgent treatment. The checking layer is now racing to catch up. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy launched a one-month effort with the FDA and the Office of the National Coordinator at the Department of Health and Human Services. Their goal is to reach a shared set of principles for benchmarking clinical AI. In plain terms, what that means is they are trying to agree on how we measure what these systems can safely do, where they fail, and when they should send a person to a clinician or even to the emergency room. Now, that 1-month schedule reveals how compressed the gap has become. These things have traditionally taken much longer. A capability can reach the public in a single release. The standards for evaluating it still have to be assembled across several federal bodies. OpenAI benefits from telling people that its models reason beyond clinicians. That claim can draw users' attention and trust toward its system. The company's own health lead softened it, though, almost immediately. And that internal correction tells us that the claim ran ahead of what OpenAI was actually prepared to defend. And yet, the underlying capability also deserves real wonder here. For most of human history, medical reasoning has been rationed by the number of trained clinicians and the hours available in their day. The cost falls hardest on people who cannot reach a doctor, or who cannot afford one, or who cannot get an appointment soon enough. A system that can read a medical record, explain a confusing result, help someone prepare questions, and notice a pattern can widen access to useful reasoning. That possibility has now shipped at national scale, and it is even more needed internationally. So its value makes rigorous testing more urgent, not less. Benchmarks need to measure missed emergencies, false reassurance, harmful recommendations, and the point at which the system recognizes that a human clinician must take over. Courts will also begin deciding what duty an AI provider owes when health advice causes foreseeable harm. These checks don't diminish the promise of this. They create the conditions under which people can really trust it. Medical reasoning is beginning to move beyond the waiting room. That could give millions, billions of people a capable partner when professional care is unavailable. OpenAI's launch proves broad access can arrive quickly. The company's inflated claim, the earlier triage failures, and the pastor's lawsuit show why access alone cannot prove safety. The scarcity is dissolving. Now the evidence has to catch up with the reach. All right, let's close it out for today. Now, a switch may bring a certain type of button or light switch or something to your mind, but today it appeared in several different forms. For Frontier AI, it appeared as a proposed technical requirement. Congress wants models built so that someone outside the lab can halt them before a failure spreads. The open question then is who receives that authority and what limits actually govern it. The durable step is making outside control part of the design. In experimental medicine, the switch was disclosure. A 6-year-old child died, and the published record left out both her death and her family's payment. Outside investigators and experts have now brought those facts into public view. Gene editing can still save countless lives. Its progress depends on records complete enough to teach the next team what went wrong. On the grid, the control appeared through cost. A unanimous committee vote says that a data center that creates the need for new power infrastructure should finance that infrastructure. Voluntary promises will fade. A federal cost rule and a FERC review can outlast that press release. And in health AI, the switch is evidence. OpenAI has widened its access to medical reasoning in one enormous step. Its own claims, though, ran ahead of the clinical record. The lawsuit and the federal benchmarking sprint are beginning to define where responsibility actually sits when advice reaches a person before the standards do. And across all 4 stories, the checking layer is getting faster. A model crosses a boundary and lawmakers answer with a design mandate. A paper hides a fatal outcome and an outside scrutiny forces those facts back into view. Data centers shift costs onto households and the binding rules begin moving those costs back. Health AI reaches the public and evaluators race to build proper tests around it. Now, this process is obviously messy because capability keeps arriving before institutions are ready. That will not stop. It will only accelerate. Weeks now separate an incident from a serious response. That is a meaningful change compared to how we've traditionally moved. But the goal is far bigger and far better than just trying to figure out how to stop things here. A halt mechanism can let us deploy powerful systems with stronger boundaries. Honest reporting can help gene editing mature into a treatment for more children. Fair grid rules can support the AI build-out without treating households as an invisible source of financing. Clinical benchmarks can help medical AI reach people who have never had enough access to medical reasoning. That is where the optimism rightly sits. We're learning to put control closer to the moment it matters, inside the architecture, inside the scientific record, inside the cost calculation, and inside the test that separates a product claim from actual demonstrated care. The future won't be secured by one person holding one switch. It will be secured by building systems where no single powerful actor controls the capability, the evidence, and the account of what happened all at once. We'll see you tomorrow.